Welcome to episode 132 of the Headspace and Timing podcast. On today's show, I have a conversation with Dr. Arie T. Greenleaf, an assistant professor at Seattle University. We talk about a program called Veterans Vision Fast and how to use Native American ceremonial healing rituals to help veterans reintegrate into their community.
They're primarily based on American Indians of the Great Plains. The healing practice that they did, the rite of passage ceremony that they conducted, in which returning warriors would be met outside the village by the elders. It was understood that the warriors had experienced traumas, experienced things in war that would affect them deeply, that would affect them psychologically, spiritually, and that these consequences couldn't just be left for the warrior to figure out on their own. There was the understanding that both the warrior and the community could be potentially harmed if the warriors were just simply allowed to come back and seamlessly integrate back into village life. And so there was ceremony conducted to mark this transition, called a vision fast, vision quest. There's different terms. So the Veterans Vision Fast does a lot to act out each one of those steps, and there's something transformative here in this process.
Welcome to the Headspace and Timing podcast, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes around veteran mental health. My name is Dwayne France, and I'm a retired Army non-commissioned officer and a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After retiring from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, then you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set correctly, however, it was just a useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing's not set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support service members, veterans, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing podcast. Once again, and as always, we really appreciate you taking the time to listen and learn more about veteran mental health. I've got a really interesting guest today because our discussion among many of the last episodes or some of the episodes in the past have been about how to help veterans transition, not just with PTSD and TBI and those issues, but sort of in a more holistic manner. And my guest today is definitely talking about doing more than just the standard treatments for veterans. So I'd like to welcome Arie Greenleaf to the show. Arie, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here and to chat with you about maybe some outside the mainstream approaches that veterans are finding very helpful.
Yeah, I really appreciated you and I connected. You just had you and some colleagues had an article published recently in one of the journals that I subscribe to, talking about rituals and how veterans will transition better with some of those rituals. Definitely want to get into that, but before I do that, I want to give you an opportunity to tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Very good. Well, I'm a associate professor of counseling at Seattle University. I've been there since year 6. I was a couple years at the University of Arkansas as well. And, well, before that, I earned a master's in counseling at Clemson and worked in some mental health counseling, worked with veterans. I am a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. And so I've always, as a therapist, had a soft spot for veterans and the issues that often arise when they transition back. And to jump to how all that led to my research with nature and looking at these unconventional forms of therapy. Following the death of my father, left a huge hole in my life and really in my heart. And he had always told stories about climbing Long's Peak. It's a 14,000 foot mountain in Rocky Mountain National Park. And he would say, no one can go from sea level to the summit in the same day. You have to acclimate. It's a really tough climb and all these things. And he climbed it as a young man and had many stories to share. Well, years later, less than a year after he died, a friend of mine who was a mountain climber, was force recon in the Marines as a medic. He told me that he was going to be going out to Colorado and he was going to climb Long's Peak. And I said, well, golly, can I come? I would love to give it a shot. I've never climbed a mountain before. So I did a lot of training and did my best to get my body ready. At the same time, you don't know how you're going to do at altitude. And we set off for the trailhead at about midnight, got there and started hiking up at about 1:30 in the morning. And I kept waiting for that big hit to come where I would lose my legs and just get altitude sickness or something. But it never came, and I had energy the whole time, and I remember I was just aware in a primordial sense, aware of the elements. I'd never been in the mountains before like that. And just the rawness, the wind, the biting of the wind, and looking at the stars. I'd never seen so many stars. And when the sun rose, it hit the diamond face of Long's Peak, and it turned into this beautiful orange alpenglow, and I was just awestruck. I was in a place where I had never been before. But when you're climbing a mountain, if any listeners have experience, you're really just kind of living in the moment. You're not really thinking all that much about how you feel. You may be aware that you're feeling kind of tired, or that wind is sure cold, or boy, these boots, I should have broken them in first. But overall, you're just kind of in it, and you're in the experience. And scholars call this, Csikszentmihalyi, who's a famous researcher, writer, he calls this flow. And you're experiencing something that challenges you and pushes you and expects something out of you that's on the cusp of being too much, on the cusp of causing maybe imminent failure. But it doesn't quite come. You're pushed in a way. And when you're in that flow state, you're not really aware of your emotions, or you're not thinking about your past. You're not thinking about your future. You're living in a very simple way in that sense, psychologically. And so I eventually, long story short, I made it to the summit, scrambled up the home stretch, and I remember I stood up there on the flat summit. It's always surprising how big the summit of Long's Peak is. I mean, you could have a ultimate frisbee game up there. And I stood there, and all of a sudden a flood of emotion came over me, and I didn't want to cry in front of my friend, who's a real tough guy and great guy, great heart, but I couldn't help it. The emotions and just taking it all in. And I realized that this is the first time I felt really connected to what I had lost. And the loss of my father, but it was a loss of other things and different traumas that, we all kind of rack up in life if we live long enough. And I realized that the mountain had brought healing. It was a catalyst for healing. And I was struck by how powerful the benefits were in that moment, of course, but then after that as well, and into weeks and months, even years later. And so when I was a doc student at the University of Iowa, I'm thinking about what I want my research to be in, what am I really passionate about? And I realized that I was very passionate about looking at how nature can be incorporated into therapy, so that others we can tap this tremendous resource that we have literally out our doors. And so I've spent now the last few years looking at that, of course, doing my research and writing, and talking to people and trying to figure out, of course, the why and the how, I guess, and then figuring practically, what do we do with this information? How does the average person take advantage, I guess, of nature in the positive sense of the term? How can we engage with nature, develop a relationship with nature? Because we're pretty divorced from it. Most of us are.
No, that's absolutely true. But I recognize, as you say, the benefit. And we hear these things of veterans walking off the war, and walking off the war being I've heard of veterans paddleboarding from Texas to DC, cross-country bike rides. Like you, in between and after my deployments, I'm here in Colorado Springs, so I've been up Pikes Peak both ways, the back way and the front way. It definitely wasn't easy, but you're right. There is this, you got to pay attention to what you're doing, especially once you get above the tree line. And so it's almost like forced mindfulness, right? You're forced to be aware. But also there's an element of you become physically worn out. And we know that when we're physically worn out, our body just doesn't have the ability to experience these extreme emotions. So we can look at these emotions, more clearly and more cleanly. And so this is something I think a lot of veterans have intuitively done. Maybe they will avoid therapy necessarily and just say, well, all I got to do is, hike, bike, run, ruck, whatever it is. And then you also mentioned this state of flow, and you, having been in the Marine Corps, pushed to the edge probably of some of your, the capacity of your abilities, and one of Csikszentmihalyi's, reasons or causes for flow. Veterans found that in the military, right? When they were in the military, there were a lot of flow moments, and they knew what it was like, even though they didn't know the name of it. And they sort of, in some ways, discover flow in nature intuitively. And so I can see how these things sort of interact, but you're looking at bringing therapy and therapeutic concepts deliberately into what veterans are intuitively finding in nature and these physical events.
Yes, and there's tremendous opportunities as well. Veterans are, in many sense, they're figuring this all out on their own. We don't have a lot of infrastructure already in place for veterans to plug themselves into, in terms of rafting trips, like you mentioned, or care farming in this country, and other examples. It's generally, these are small, barely sustainable organizations that are holding on by their fingernails, and it's very difficult for them to get the funding that they need. They, of course, apply for grants and do the best that they can, and oftentimes they close down, and that's unfortunate, and that's what I focus my research on. It's unfortunate because they seem to work. Veterans are they're voting with their feet, and they're signing up for all these experiences in droves. And in many cases, these are huge time commitments and financial commitments, and yet they're still doing it. The issue, though, is many of these organizations and these different kinds of therapies, as we'll call them, they don't have research behind them, or the research is scant, or it is primarily anecdotal. I have quotes to share with you. Rant provider, here's a quote. And unfortunately, that doesn't muster the evidence that's needed if an organization is going to receive a $500,000 grant. And so I decided to get into this to partly one, I'm fascinated by it, and I've experienced it personally, and I believe in it. But the other is to see, can we provide the evidence necessary to change how mental health care is conducted in this country for veterans, for everyone, and to provide that evidence so that we can create viable and plentiful opportunities for veterans to get involved in all these different kinds of ways outside of traditional talk therapy or psychotropic medications, which have their place. And so that's what we've been doing. We've been building that evidence base.
And this is something that, and it came out of the article that I'd mentioned before. And for those listening in the article's effects of a rite of passage ceremony on veterans' well-being. We've talked before on the show about the need for this, the ceremonial sort of transition. I've had Sebastian Younger on the show. He's definitely talked about that in his book Tribe. But I was surprised to see, and in the article, or perhaps it was some of the additional material, that there's not a lot of research done on these ceremonial transitions for veterans. Veterans will go to sweat lodges. They will go to these. We had Dr. Ed Tick on the show where he said he had taken a Native American veteran back to Vietnam to complete a ritual that he hadn't completed before. And so, like you said, we hear that these things work, and veterans know that these things work. And the state of where we're at right now, like you said, we have to prove that things work. But I was surprised to find that these, specifically the rite of passage and the ritual ceremonial aspects of transition, that's not been researched before.
No, there's very little research on them. When I was first approached by a friend of mine, veteran, who had faced his own demons following, I believe, 3 deployments to both Iraq and Afghanistan, I met him before he went on the vision fast, before he experienced this rite of passage. And first time I met him, he was giving a talk, and the rawness, the emotions that poured out of him, the stories that he shared, we were all just captivated. And you could tell that this person was facing down demons and was still in the middle of that fight, but was doing his best to still make a positive impact on others and to be there and had taken up leadership roles. Well, maybe a year went by, or 9 months, something like that went by before I talked with him again. I got a text from him saying, "Hey, can we chat?" So I started talking with him, and he shared with me that he had gone on this vision fast, and I had no real context for that. That was not really part of my background in terms of the literature reviews that I've done, or my reading, or my research, but I was intrigued. And he talked about, since he'd gotten back, all of the positive changes, and that he was curious if I would research it and to see is there evidence, scientific evidence, that would be supportive of what's happening here. And so I really just jumped at the chance. I said, absolutely, let's see what's going to this, and put together a very solid study. We did a mixed method study that was really the first of its kind, not only focusing on rite of passage ceremony and a vision fast, and it's applying quantitative and qualitative data, but we also used a data collection app in order to do this, which was probably the first time that had ever been done too, in the way that we designed our methodology. And what allowed us, though, to get our quantitative data back and then form qualitative questions, the items that we constructed were based on the quantitative data that came back. So we were able to design a very solid study. We used a concurrent multiple baseline design so that we could establish a solid pre-treatment level of overall well-being or symptomology. So you have a time at point A. That was 2 weeks before they went. And we get data at that point. And then we got data the day before they went to the vision fast. And so then we could compare time point A, which is 2 weeks before, and time point B, the day before they go. We can look to make sure that those two data points line up. If they're already trending up, then you can't then say that any changes are due to the actual treatment. But in this case, all of our participants, how they're doing at point A matched how they're doing at point B. So then what we did is they went out on this 12-day vision fast, and we had the data collection app ready to go upon their return. So that time point C, which shows the day after the vision fast, we collected then the quantitative data. And we were measuring PTSD symptoms, we were measuring depression, we were looking at changes in psychological, emotional, social well-being. And so then, just for good measure, we hit them with a time point D, 1 month following the return from the vision fast. So now we have 4 time points of quantitative data that we can look and see it for each individual, what were the changes. And thankfully, in a sense, the time point A to time point B were steady. So now we can look to see what happens to the symptoms or potentially improvements in well-being at time point C. And the results were frankly, for lack of a better word, shocking. I've been doing this a long time. I've worked with a lot of veterans, and I'm very familiar with all of the different kinds of therapies out there to treat PTSD, treat depression, treat other psychological disorders, so-called. And I know from experience that most treatments have an effect size range 0.2 to 0.4, 0.5. If you're getting into the 0.4, 0.5 range, you're into a very strong treatment in our field. Most of those are behavioral. Like someone has a phobia, and then you introduce like some type of exposure therapy to them, some kind. And as a result, 6 hours later or 6 days later, whatever it might be, they're no longer afraid of spiders. That would be a very strong effect size. And you can get up to the 0.7 range in those, and even 0.8. So I'm using this vernacular fairly loosely, but just understanding that probably most of the audience doesn't have a background in statistics. But you give the idea of how strong these changes were. Our effect sizes ranged at the low end at 0.72 and at the high end 0.92. So their results indicate near miraculous healing that occurred in terms of PTSD symptoms, depression symptoms, improvement in psychological, emotional, and social well-being. And so we thankfully had this time point D in place just to see, all right, does it just completely fall off the wagon? Maybe this is a flash in the pan kind of a thing. And yeah, they're in this state of euphoria following, but they get back to the real world and it's all going to crash back down. But it was not the case. The results did not change significantly. They maintained. And so I want to be cautious here. I don't want to sell this idea that this is a silver bullet, that this is all you need, and this is going to be a one and done deal, and then you're going to be great. It's not. It's going to take. It would take follow up. It would take continued work. But at the same time, when the United States is struggling, and to the degree that it is, to help transition veterans back from the military, anything that we can do to set them on the right path to get that healing process jump started, that's what we need to be investigating, and that's what we need to try to figure out how to do a better job of. But this study was so out there that we said we have to replicate this, so we did. So we followed it up. This initial study was done with the inaugural Veterans Vision Fast in 2017. So we followed it up last year, the 2018 Veterans Vision Fast. And, well, the results were, even though we had more participants and there were some additional factors that were interesting to say the least that may have affected some of the results. I'm not sure. I can explain more about this in a bit. But the results were still fantastic. They still showed changes, I think, at the low end of 0.5 and the high end, again, up there around that 0.9 range. So this works. This worked for now 2 years in a row. And when you stop and think about it, going maybe back to Tribe and Sebastian Junger's work, I think he's really on to something there. And I maybe it's not surprising. Maybe it's even egotistical to be surprised, because American Indians, for that matter, people around the world, societies going back and far back into antiquity, have used these kinds of ceremonies to help their returning warriors transition back into the tribe, transition back into their village as contributing members of society. And so, the reason I say maybe egotistical is, from a Western medicine perspective, this may all seem a bit too far removed from science, or too far removed from, pills and things that are easily controlled for. But if people are doing something for 10, 15, 30, 40, 50,000 years, and there's nothing in the anthropological record to say that any of these communities suffered from epidemics of post-war, post-combat psychological trauma. There's nothing in the oral histories. There's nothing in the written histories. And this is what they've been doing as a healing practice. We should pay attention.
You're absolutely right, and again, this is some discussions that we've had here on the show. But the concept of the Israeli soldiers and having a low instance of PTSD, and there are a number of different studies around that. Shared experiences as a majority, if not all, of the adult individuals in the Israeli army served in the military. In Israeli society served in the military. But Dr. Tick again had mentioned that in Vietnam was the same thing. Is the Vietnam War veterans on the Vietnamese side do not have the instances of post-traumatic stress disorder that our veterans do. And again pointed to this idea of this, very focused, very ritualistic sort of ceremonial observance of the events. You've mentioned a couple times about the Vision Fast and the 12-day Vision Fast. I'm wondering if you could go through very briefly and explain what this is, because listeners are saying, well, I want some of that. How do I get some of that?
Sure. Well, the Vision Fast that we worked with, put on by the School of Lost Borders, it may not be the only one available. I'm not sure. But they are, and so that being said, it may change from one Vision Fast to another if there's more than one out there. But probably they all contain the same nuts and bolts, the same procedures, and they're based on primarily based on American Indians of the Great Plains, and the healing practice that they did, the rite of passage ceremony that they conducted, in which returning warriors would be met outside the village by the elders. It was understood that the warriors had experienced traumas, experienced things in war that would affect them deeply, that would affect them psychologically, spiritually, and that these consequences couldn't be left. Couldn't just be left for the warrior to figure out on their own. There was the understanding that both the warrior and the community could be potentially harmed if the warriors were just simply allowed to come back and seamlessly integrate back into village life. And so there was ceremony conducted to mark this transition, and called a vision fast, vision quest. There's different terms. Some of the components. The first is called severance, in which through ceremony the elders would prepare a sacred place for the veteran, for the warrior, to remove themselves, to separate themselves, to leave behind what they had gone through, so it was a preparation for the threshold, second part of this, in which the warrior would spend 4 days, 4 nights alone, and typically it was that period. It could be longer, and fasting with only water, and within a circle, where they're left to themselves. They're left to their thoughts. They were left with nature. They oftentimes would see animals that they believed would be guiding spirits sent from the Great Spirit. These are referred to as totems. And that these totems provided insight, provided new ways of understanding themselves, the world, maybe the war. And there was ultimately then healing, medicine, that came from this experience of clarity. So it was very much a spiritual healing. And of course, in our society, religious people refer to spirituality and spiritual things, but the medical community doesn't really have a place for spirituality many times. But this was part and parcel. This was integral to the understanding of healing from war, was this spiritual quest and finding medicine in that realm. And so following the fasting, the 4-day period, they would return. The third component is the incorporation. And they would then share with their fellow warriors, with the elders and the council of elders, what discoveries they had made, what insights they had gained. They would share their totems and the personal meaning that these have. And they would share, and they would give witness as well. And the giving witness is integral. It's very important, because this is the social cohesion. This is the community that is formed. And it's through the isolating experience of being out there in the raw elements alone that one then is prepared to come back to community and to integrate and to find one's place in the larger tribe. So following that, they would return to the village. They would be brought in, the elders would lead them in, and there would be typical celebrations. There would be the rest of the tribe would acknowledge their sacrifices, acknowledge on all that they had to give. Acknowledge that they had gone into war to protect the village. Maybe the word is the rest of the village was appreciative and bestowed upon them the greater status, and the belief that they then possessed higher knowledge, higher wisdom. They experienced something that the rest of the tribe could not understand unless they had also been in war. And so they were seen as possessing something that the rest of the village didn't. And so they were esteemed. So the Veterans Vision Pass does a lot to symbolize each one of those steps and to act out each one of those steps. And like I said earlier, there's something transformative here in this process. Yes.
That this idea of whether it is ceremonial, that last sharing and mutual appreciation, appreciating the warrior, appreciating the community for allowing it back in, and then the community appreciating the warrior. There's this idea of ceremonies are sort of one and done type of things, right? That they're, in the military specifically is what I'm thinking of. But there really is a lot of buildup, say to a promotion ceremony in the military, is you have to prepare for that. You have to promotion boards and go to particular schools or different things like that. You actually have to earn that. Same thing with boot camp or basic training. There is a ceremony at the end, as you were talking about. And this is something actually that one of your participants shared, and I'll read it here. He said, "We received intensive basic and advanced training on how to be a soldier or warrior, but received little training to assist us in returning to civilian life or a rite of passage back into society that isn't at war." And we know that, right? I was thinking of when I went to airborne school, they pinned the wings on my chest, and same thing when I got my senior rated wings for jump master and all these different things. There were all these ceremonies. And what I didn't realize is I was preparing for this call is each one of those had an ordeal in many ways that built up to this ceremonial aspect. So this idea of the Vision Fast, it's not just, hey, veterans, come in on a Saturday afternoon and we're going to perform a ceremony. The Vision Fast is actually a measure of an ordeal that then ends in a ceremony. Does that ring true?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think so. I do. I think that's it's missing. It's what's most obviously missing in the transition back, compared to peoples of our past, societies of our past. And what's fascinating, though, is that you mentioned the Israelis and their 1% PTSD rates, and best estimates, and it's a wide range. We have anywhere from the low end of maybe 10%, and some studies would suggest as high as 30% rates of PTSD. And while even the British are somewhere around 3 to 6%. So these numbers invite, I think, some critical analysis and thinking about what causes PTSD. The obvious answer is, well, trauma, and it's true. Trauma does cause PTSD. We can't escape that. And yet there seem to be powerful moderating factors that, for whatever reason, are getting overlooked. And maybe the most powerful moderating factor is society itself. And I would suggest that the high rates of PTSD, depression, suicide, lives falling apart post-war is more a consequence of our larger society than the war itself. And it says more about us than it does about veterans. But it also points to, I think, the right kinds of solutions, the right kinds of answers. And medicine, for all of its miracles and the advancements in technology, the positives that come from that in terms, all of it, longevity and health, it is a very reductionist philosophy at its base. And it tries to solve things efficiently as possible, and there's typically costs and profits going on. But when we start thinking about what is actually going to help veterans, what's actually going to best support them in this transition, I think we need to look at what are they experiencing socially upon their return, and how best do we reintegrate them socially into our society, which is largely alienating. It's a very lonely society for the most part. So the recent number I saw, 74% of people feel lonely on a weekly basis. Nearly 30% of us live alone. Nearly 30% say that at any point in their lives they have no one they can talk to about meaningful things. And for, again, all the wonders and benefits of capitalism, our version of capitalism in this country is highly competitive. We don't have the same degree of social safety net. The blessings and wonders of being a multicultural society also at times can fracture us. And we can be at war with each other in this country. And we see that now as well around political and cultural issues, about group identities based in politics. So, we're a very fractured society, and all of that is juxtaposed, of course, with a small tribe of 50 to 100 people who understand intimately well what sacrifices you've gone through, in the sense that the very survival of your family and the rest of the tribe is dependent on the warrior's success. And in Israel, as another example, where everyone, for the most part, if you're not Orthodox Jew, everyone understands the personal experience what it means to be a veteran because of mandatory service. And a country that small, that's experienced as much combat as it has, everyone's lives, everyone's families, for the most part, have been impacted. And so the separation between war and civilian society in a place like Israel is not much of a line. While in our society, it's a chasm. You can be completely out of the loop. I wouldn't be surprised if half the people in this country still think, we're in Iraq, and we still have 200,000 troops on the ground. Maybe people don't know, is my point. Whatever percentage can't even find Iraq on the map. So I think it's that separation, and that's the alienating aspect of it is what is missing, and ultimately then is a powerful moderating variable. We don't have that moderating variable, and so many veterans suffer from, as a result of combat or trauma of some sort, short-term PTSD, which has its evolutionary advantages. It prepares people to deal with immediate threats. Through rumination, we go over and over and over again possible solutions. Depression kind of takes us out of the game for a bit to protect us, so that we don't do anything impulsive and put ourselves further at risk. So one can make the argument that short-term PTSD is a viable evolutionary strategy for survival. And it's the long-term stuff. It's the chronic PTSD that in this country we're doing a really bad job of avoiding.
You're absolutely right. And again, this goes back to, and it's something ever since I talked to him on the show, Sebastian Younger says the affluence of our society is causing this separation. A friend of mine describes it as we live in boxes, right? We have a box that we live in, then we have another box that we drive to the box that we work in. We leave that box and we come back and we drive in the garage, we close the garage, and how much do we know our neighbors and what have you, right? So there's this idea of increasingly isolated, even if it is within our own small groups. And yes, we can even curate, in a sense, the information that we receive that echoes what we believe. And so it just becomes this echo chamber. And this is the thing, this sense of isolation, this lack of connectedness, then reinforces the idea that civilians don't get me. And civilians don't get me because I don't get civilians in many ways. And so it's sort of like a self-perpetuating cycle. And it can definitely seem like And again, not just Vision Fast, but organizations like Boulder Crest Retreat or, or these different Operation Odyssey with Wounded Warrior Project that takes a veteran into nature, and provides some sort of, ceremonial aspect. I think that, like you said, it definitely has promise, and definitely appreciate you taking the time to research it and continue the research, as you said, is just continue to verify. If people wanted to find out more about the work you're doing or get in touch with you and ask, how can they get a hold of you?
Well, they can reach me, of course, through email, and that's my last name, Greenleaf. The color green, like a leaf on a tree, at seattleu.edu, seattleuniversity.edu. And I love chatting with people about what we found and about ways that veterans can get involved. I want to say one last thing about care farming, which I think also holds tremendous promise. We have many care farms, so-called, in Europe, hundreds, if not thousands. I don't know how many there are in the United States, but not many. And there, it's very much part of even mainstream healthcare. And here, of course, that's not the case at all. But these are for-profit farms. They typically don't make a lot of profit, but they're for-profit farms that allow or provide access for veterans to come, and it could be other populations of people too, where people go and they work on a farm. And these are not as intensive as a 12-day Vision Fast. But they also provide community, and they provide an opportunity to access nature, to create. And the founder, Chris Brown, a Marine, was wounded in Fallujah, Purple Heart recipient, came back, was dealing with, of course, the common issues of that, and was talking with a counselor, and the counselor said, "You should get a plant, Chris. Just grow it." He fill in more of the details of the story, but he did. He got a plant, he put the plant on his deck, and he started growing this plant. And he shared that act of facilitating life, of creating life, if you will, or at least supporting life, juxtaposed with the death, the destruction, the carnage, was a catalyst for his own healing. He went on then, within just a couple years after this, to start a farm called Growing Veterans, which is in Bellingham, Washington. And that farm now has seen hundreds and hundreds of veterans come through, who come when they want, work when they want, and build that community. And we did a study on that one, I guess that's 2 or 3 years ago now, which is published. Found that it worked tremendously to build social cohesion, so a sense of social support, and improved well-being. And I think that's really important. Going back to that point you made about feeling like others don't get you. There's a term for this called experiential loneliness. And this is when you can have loved ones who really care about you and ask you how you're doing and let you know that they're always going to be there for you, but you still feel really lonely. You still feel really disconnected. And there's even a qualitative study that shows that in those cases, as much effort as the family or loved ones might give to try to connect with the veteran feels like that's not helpful. It feels equally lonely because people don't understand. So these types of care farms, or doing the rafting, or going on Vision Fast, I think they all have the same active ingredient, which is getting veterans connected with other veterans who understand them and give them something, or a place, or a group to connect with. There's many of these types of organizations and activities, and I think what it is what do you like to do outside, and where do you like to do it, and find your niche.
No, that's a great point, and I did see the article on care farming, I'm going to have you and maybe your buddy back on the show to talk about that. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show today, Arie.
Oh, thank you, Dwayne. I had a great time talking with you, and I hope that what we shared will be a catalyst for our listener out there to find some way to get involved in one of these cool activities and find their healing.
Sounds good. I appreciate it.
Okay. Bye, Ben.
You're listening to Headspace and Timing, where we're trying to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health. There are many paths to a single destination, and I've known a number of veterans who've experienced and been helped by similar programs that use Native American ceremonies to reintegrate. I talked about a couple of different episodes during my conversation with Arie, primarily episode 117 with Sebastian Younger and episodes 109 and 110 with Dr. Ed Tick. A lot of this discussion is about how challenging it is for veterans to reintegrate into society after leaving the military. It's not impossible, but it takes effort, including effort on the part of the veteran. It's not that we can't reintegrate, but we have to want to. Programs like the ones that Arie and I discussed on this show can help us do so. Thanks for taking the time to listen. If you want to find the show notes for this episode, go to veteranmentalhealth.com/HST132. If you want to show your support for the work that we're doing, make sure to subscribe on your podcast player of choice. We're always looking for guests, either veterans or those who support them. You can drop me a line at info@veteranmentalhealth.com to recommend guests, or you can go to veteranmentalhealth.com/guest to fill out a suggestion or request. I'm happy to announce that I've released a paperback version of the first Headspace and Timing book. It's been available on Kindle for a couple of years, but now you can get it along with Combat Vet Don't Mean Crazy. To check them out, go to veteranmentalhealth.com/books. Just a reminder that the guests and information on this show are for educational purposes only and not meant to be considered professional advice. While I'm a practicing therapist, I'm not your therapist. If something you've heard makes you think that you should talk to somebody, then reach out to do so. I'd like to thank Doc Todd for giving us permission to use his track Not Alone from his album Combat Medicine. Doc's trying to bring the discussion about veteran mental health out of the darkness, and you can see all of his work at therealdoctodd.com. Make sure to join us for the next episode. Hit subscribe on your podcast player. Until next time, remember, veterans, you're not alone, ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created enemies. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic Tennessee, embrace my ability.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep staying. How this life's so demanding, so much pain, all this plenty. I heard each time my way, but with you I'm not alone. You're not alone. Yeah. Every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every med that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision Lasix, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep staying.
Stand up.
How this life's so demanding, so much pain, all this plenty. I heard each time my way, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. Yeah. You're not alone.
And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, pick myself back up again.
Yeah, just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone, I'm right here. And I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain. Stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.